Hello and welcome to Other Voices, brought to you by Peninsula Peace and Justice Center. I'm your host, Paul George. As we're taping this program, 1 week remains until a highly anticipated, bitter election takes place in this country. The quadrennial presidential campaign is coming to an end. It's been an intense time, and we will know in 1 week how it comes out, or will we? That's the question for tonight, because as we often hear, when it's time to go cast our ballots, be sure you vote because every vote counts. The question is, does every vote get counted? To help us understand what might be the problem as we move into the electronic age of voting and vote counting, I'm glad to be joined by Jonathan Simon. Jonathan is the author of a brand new book, a brand new updated book called Code Red, Computerized Election Theft and the New American Century. And as I mentioned, it's just been updated for this current election year. Jonathan is a graduate of Harvard College and New York University School of Law. He served as a political survey research analyst for the Peter D. Hart Research Associates in Washington, D.C. This experience led him to analyze official exit polling data, which served as an initial basis for his questioning the validity of the count in election 2004. And he's continued this kind of analysis ever since, and that's what we're here to talk about. Jonathan, welcome to Other Voices.
Thanks, Paul. It's great to be here.
Glad to have you here. Now, on the campaign trail, we've been hearing a lot about rigged elections and people not counting votes and all that sort of stuff. And we've also heard about things like voter suppression, that sort of thing, to have a direct effect, kind of the overt effects on voter turnout, votes actually cast. Let's go through some of those. I think audience and most people who are paying attention are aware of them, but let's first tackle this accusation on the part of one of, let's say, an unnamed candidate. We have to be completely impartial here as a nonprofit. No, you can fire away.
Good to know.
And actually, I'll fire away too. This idea of in-person voter fraud. I don't think anybody except Donald Trump's followers believe it, but your reaction to that is a problem in our elections.
Well, for better or for worse, Donald Trump has tens of millions of followers, so that's a lot of believers in something that's been put out there that has very, very little factual basis. There is the scattering of in-person voter fraud. Research has shown out of some billion ballots cast, there were 10 cases of impersonational voting, the kind of voting that would be, that you'd have voter ID to prevent. So it's a very, very, very rare phenomenon. And it's certainly not the kind of scheme that is efficient or capable of changing the results of any significant major election. Maybe a school board election where there are 300 votes, 10 people voting twice changes that. Not the presidential election, not the federal elections, not statewide elections, not even state legislative elections.
Let's put a little context on this, or numbers. How many ballots are cast for president?
Well, it varies from election to election, but it's over 100 million.
Okay, yeah. So to swing it one way or the other, you'd have to have at least 100,000 or even 1 million people trying to do this kind of fraud.
At least, and doing it individually, and if you try to organize them, I mean, that becomes a pretty obvious violation of the law. We just haven't found it. Again, it's flat out a canard. It's something that's been thrown out there to lower the level of trust in our electoral process. And the irony there, and this is something we will get to, is there's every reason to lower the level of trust in our electoral process. Impersonational individual voter fraud is just not one reason for it.
I can't leave this topic behind without mentioning, though, that there has been one arrest so far this year for in-person voter fraud, the woman who tried to vote twice for Donald Trump because she was afraid her vote wasn't going to be counted. the other big thing in the news a lot is voter suppression laws, and has been in the news a lot. And this does affect large numbers of people. Is this election tipping levels? What's your impression on these voter suppression laws?
Voter suppression, that's something that's coming closer to the core because that's happening from the inside. This is administrators, legislators, basically passing legislation, a lot of it templated by ALEC, which is a right-wing think tank that produces this legislation.
The American Legislative Exchange Council.
Correct. Yeah. That is basically designed to systemically suppress the vote of minorities, the elderly, the young, the poor. And it's quite effective when these laws are allowed to stand. I mean, many of them have now been challenged in court, and the courts, by and large, have split on these kind of laws, very often finding them unconstitutional, especially when the discriminatory intent is obvious, when they've gone and done research on when do blacks cast their votes. Okay, they vote early, we're going to do away with early voting. I mean, I'm being a bit simplistic, but basically it's pretty close to that. It's extremely cynical. It's not new. There has been, a strategy to discourage voters and then outright suppress voters, prevent them from voting by a variety of individual tactics. Voter ID is one, caging is another, where you challenge them at the polls, send them into provisional ballots, which are likely not to get counted, intimidation, all sorts of techniques. And the idea is that if you don't have a legitimate majority of the public and of the voters, elections are pretty high stakes. They're for all the marbles. And you basically have to pull out all the stops to come up with the electoral results that you want. And so Harvey Wasserman and Bob Fitrakis, two of my colleagues, recently put out a book in 2016. It's called Strip and Flip, the Strip and Flip election of 2016. And the strip part is where you prevent the voters that are likely to vote for your opponent. And with today's big data, they're very easy to identify.
Yeah.
And you basically prevent them from voting by all sorts of means. You can shorten poll hours, you can shorten early voting periods, you can consolidate polling places so that people who don't have cars won't be able to get to them. And when they do get to them, because they're consolidated, you're going to have enormous lines. This is not random.
And that's the kind of thing that a legislature doesn't do, but a local election official who's usually appointed by the party in power makes the decision about how many voting precincts there will be, how many machines at each one.
Yes, it can be done on an administrative level. It's generally pretty, below the radar. But usually there's complicity from legislatures as well.
Yeah.
I mean, it's basically top down, all the way down. And it's a pretty, organized and thought through process to change the Constitution. I don't mean the U.S. Constitution, change the pool of voters.
Yeah.
And by doing that, change the results of elections, even if they were being fairly tabulated, even if the count was correct. This would have a major impact. And frankly, for most of the computerized voting period at least, and really for most of the past century, dating well back, this has been something undertaken primarily by Republicans. They want to keep the voting populace as small as possible. We've seen signs that it's spread to the Democratic Party in the 2016 primaries. There was a fair amount of evidence that the Democratic insiders were trying to block the Bernie Sanders voters, many of whom were first-time voters, many of whom were easy to block because they had to go through a registration process or they had to switch parties. So all sorts of regulations were put into place. Voting rolls were scrubbed, in many cases, over-scrubbed. And a lot of people found that they went to the polls and were not registered or weren't allowed to vote or were forced to vote on provisional ballots. And from the Sanders supporters' standpoint, that was a very important technique in a very tight primary contest, nomination contest, that cost him a potential victory.
And then there's just long-standing but pretty outrageous rules. I think it was New York where a lot of people were discovering that they had to register like 4 or 5 months in advance of the election, and it just doesn't allow for the energy and excitement of a campaign, especially like Bernie Sanders, where people 6 months ago probably thought they weren't going to vote in a primary. Now they were anxious to, and it was too late to register.
Right, it worked like a charm, but I would have to draw the distinction between sort of legitimate cheating and illegitimate cheating. Setting your
Let's draw that
deadlines,
line.
yeah, setting your deadlines 5 or 6 months in advance is probably just good administrative politics. I mean, it's within the capacity of a legislature to do that, or in the capacity of a board of elections to do that. And it's, to some extent, it's too bad, so sad. It's not how we would like to see our country run, but it's not the same as caging, for instance, and challenging voters en masse at the polls, or intimidating voters, sending out thugs, or setting, ludicrous standards for being able to get an ID. I mean, there's a kind of a continuum between things where, okay, well, that's what the rule is, and it's pretty obvious that it's favoring an establishment candidate, and then things that you look at and they smell worse and worse and worse. And at the end of that continuum, the really foul smell are the covert methods that are used to alter vote counts. And that's largely the emphasis of Code Red, although I will say that all of it is important, and we're in a situation now of both and, where you have to basically pull out all the stops, overt and covert, to thwart the voice of the public.
And we will get to the gist of your book here in just a minute, but I want to stick with the overt. One more major area, and this one I think people are a little less fully aware of, and that's the issue of gerrymandering, constructing congressional districts and other legislative districts to favor one party over another. And this is based on the fact that whoever happens to be in control the year after the census is taken gets to redraw the districts. And I'm sure you've probably read Jane Mayer's fine book, Dark Money. There's a very good explanation in there of wealthy right-wing operatives and supporters getting together after the 2008 election to be prepared for the redrawing of the districts after 2010. And they had Project Red Map, and they used the computers to figure it out, and that's how they took control of so many state houses. Have you looked into much on the effects of gerrymandering?
Yes, and I will say David Daley, also in the book Rat Fucked, was focused very specifically on the 2010 election and the Red Map project. Gerrymandering itself actually predates Elbridge Gerry, who was, a Revolutionary era fellow, and it just happened to pick up his name, but it was already being done before he even came on the scene. So it's a very, very old strategy. What has given it particular power in the modern age is the advent of big data, and so it becomes very possible with the intrusion into private lives and the knowledge that the government now has of basically everybody and what they buy and who they are likely to vote for, et cetera, to go practically house by house in drawing your maps. So the 2010 election was seen as absolutely critical. The Democrats are almost always a few steps behind in this, and apparently they didn't recognize it quite as such. But it was a critical, absolutely critical election. If you had a war room, you'd be focusing on 2010. We're going to take control of all these state houses. We are then going to gerrymander the hell out of these districts and basically have what amounts to what Karl Rove referred to as a permanent Republican majority, or a dynasty. The tie-in to the covert is that the 2010 election gave very strong evidence of actually having been manipulated in terms of the vote count. So here you have an election which is sort of under the radar, extremely critical in terms of its impact, because this gerrymandered seats are safe seats, and they take on a real permanence, and it's very, very hard to change. And that would apply to the House, the U.S. House. It applies to the state houses. And the Senate is already, in a funny kind of way, pre-gerrymandered, because half the population of the United States is represented by 18 senators, largely from the blue states. So how the Democrats even remain competitive in the Senate is something of a miracle, because 82 senators represent mostly the red states. So you look at the Senate, you look at the House, you look at the state houses, that's a tremendous amount of infrastructural power in politics. Presidents come and go, but you take control of that and you lock it in with gerrymandering. That is really the big prize. It's below the radar. In a presidential election year like this, everybody is so focused on the presidential election, and largely, the media obviously leads that, that these down ballot races, particularly state house races, U.S. House of Representatives even, receive very, very little scrutiny. That makes them extremely easy to rig with very, very little risk of detection.
And of course, these are the very legislatures that will be writing the next round of voter suppression laws. Yeah, and the Senate, that would be a whole other topic for discussion, when there are two senators from Wyoming who represent fewer people than our local congresswoman here in her one district. Okay. Let's get to the main point of your book, Code Red, and that's the electronic voting, which has really come on, especially since the 2000 election. We had hanging chads, quite famously. Let's start with just an overview of what some of the electronic machines are, and where they're being used, and kind of how they work. Just a quick overview so people know. Here in Santa Clara County, and I think also in San Mateo, we use the optical scanners. I think that's mostly around California. But what are some of the other electronic devices that people are voting on around the country these days? Yeah,
very roughly, there aren't many. I mean, you basically have optical scanners. You put your ballot in, and it swallows your ballot.
You mark the ballot first.
You mark the ballot first, put it in, reads it, swallows it, and it drops into a bin. Most electronic voting is optical scan voting at this point. DREs, or touch screens, where you touch a candidate or a proposition, whatever it is, and it records that vote electronically. Their heyday has sort of come and gone. There used to be more of them. There were so many problems with them, and especially in the situation where there were electronic glitches and there was no way of recovering the votes. I mean, that was a big major issue that came up a couple of times. But they still account for about a quarter of the vote counting in this country, including the majority of the vote counting, or all of the vote counting, in certain states. Georgia, Pennsylvania, Virginia has some. Well, Virginia just got rid of them. They're the state that sort of saw the light under a Democratic governor and got rid of the DREs. But a lot of the
Pennsylvania
states,
has the touchscreen?
Yeah, paperless DREs. And so a lot of these are swing states in which enough of the voting is done on these basically unrecountable, unauditable, complete black boxes, that it should give everybody, the willies, real pause. But that is not to say that optical scanners are safe, and that's one of the false dichotomies that's been put out there. Well, if you vote on paper and if you have a paper record, all's right with the world. And of course it's not, because if you look historically at even the most suspect elections, the ballots, once dropped into the OpScan, they become corporate property. The public has no access to them. The candidates have no access to them. In most cases, election administrators have no access to them. They never again see the light of day. So there really is no significant difference, pragmatically speaking, between voting on a touchscreen machine and voting on an optical scanner, where those ballots are effectively buried for their duration and then destroyed.
All right, let's go over that a minute, because I had the impression that, like with the optical scanners, let's talk about the voting part now. They run these through, and the computer counts the votes, and I guess reports it into some central place. Let's take Santa Clara County or Santa Cruz, where you are now, or just locally. The electronic counting is first done at the county level, is that?
It varies. In many cases, the electronic counting is done, and California is a little bit atypical of the rest of the country, but and it varies all throughout the country the way this is done. Some of these machines, you'll hear and you'll find in the papers these days, as part of the overall defense of the sanctity of our electoral system, that none of these computers are hooked up to the internet. That is just flat out untrue. Many of them are equipped with modems, and if you're equipped with a modem, you might as well be hooked up to the internet. So in terms of accessibility to hackers and manipulators. So in some cases, the machine does the counting right at the precinct, and then that memory card is transported. In some cases, it's electronically transported as opposed to physically. Wires, sometimes it's through wire, sometimes it's in a truck, sometimes it's the whole machine in a truck. I mean, this is a pastiche of a vote counting system that was, ironically, the president came out and said, because we have such a diverse vote counting system, it's effectively immune to manipulation. And I respect most of the things that have come out of President Obama's mouth. This is not one of them. This made absolutely no sense whatsoever. It was a hastily sort of jerry-rigged, response to this all of a sudden crisis of confidence in our electoral system. But it's anything but true. If you are a national grade rigger and you are trying to control the outcome of elections and control the future of this country and a business and whatnot, you have the sophistication to go system by system, and there aren't very many of them, figure out where the back doors are, figure out where the vulnerabilities are. And for that matter, the only real concern that's been thrown about, it got into the New York Times, it got into Politico, is concern about hackers. The Russians are coming, the external outsiders coming in and hacking.
Yeah.
And the logic of this really does, it truly boggles the mind that this emphasis can be placed on outsiders hacking, and literally not a word spoken, not a single raised eyebrow addressed to the corporate insiders and all those connected with them who actually do the programming, who are already on the inside, who don't have to hack, who can just simply maliciously program these machines to mistabulate votes. Not a word about that. And that tells you pretty much all you need to know about where we are circa 2016.
Okay, I do want to step back and try to take this step by step, so people who haven't read your book yet, and I know everybody here is
I gave away the ending.
Yeah, you gave away the ending.
Not quite,
Spoiler alert.
Yeah.
But so people really understand this. What really caught me when you said just a little while ago, once the ballot goes into the counting machine, that's it for public ownership of that ballot. And I want to check on that, because I thought the process where we have this ultimately electronic voting, even though we're marking these optically scanned ballots, is that I thought a lot of states do this, that they take randomly selected precincts and actually count paper ballots and compare that to what the machine came up. And if everything looks right in this handful, some percentage of randomly selected precincts, they sign off on the electronic counting of the ballots. Yeah. Am I wrong about that, or does that
half right, half wrong? In about half the states, there are audit protocols. There are another half the states that have no audit protocols, and in many of the states with audit protocols, because that's what it's considered as an audit, there are many ways in which an audit can be ineffective. And California has one of the better ones. It's scrupulously executed 1% audit that, for the most part, has been observed and followed. The protocol has been fairly random, and it's one reason why, from a forensic standpoint, which is what we do, we've seen that California, almost throughout the computerized era, the last 15 years or so, has been left alone. And California is the shining example of a state that, I mean, you can take Prop 8 and look at that maybe in a separate box, but with very few exceptions, it's been left alone from a covert rigging standpoint. But in most states with audits, there's a problem with the timing, there's a problem with the randomness, there's a problem with the sensitivity of the audit and what happens when you find disparities, how a disparity is defined. Almost all of the states that have audits, and this includes what was formerly my home state of Massachusetts, there's no provision for what happens when you find disparities. It's the Secretary of State gets to say, we'll do something about it, we won't do something about it. There's no automatic, okay, if it's off by 5%, we expand the search. So these audits, you know.
So I thought Massachusetts had one of the stronger audit laws, but if they find a big enough discrepancy, there's no automatic count all the ballots by hand kicks in?
Nope. And, you know, and up until 2016, Massachusetts had no audit law at all. I mean, this is a new 3% flat audit. We, you know, in election integrity, there was a battle royal over whether audits were enough or we really needed to have hand-counted paper ballots. And that battle raged around legislation proposed by Rush Holt. It was the Holt bill. It divided the movement very, you know, at many points to the point where it was impossible to cooperate or even communicate. It was a very serious division. And, you know, I have come around being something of a pragmatist. I would love to see our democracy expressed in the form of people taking it seriously enough and taking it enough to heart to come out on election night. 4 hours per voter lifetime is what it would demand. I've already served 11 days of jury duty, so we're talking about a very minimal burden. Come out, be cooperative, be congregational, participate in the counting process so that it can be observable. Yeah, hand-counted paper ballots. That having been said, it is, to most people, ludicrous. I mean, computers do everything. Why, you know, why should we retreat to the 18th century? So it's a tough nut. They've returned to it in Germany, they've returned to it in the Netherlands, they've returned to it in Ireland, at least for many of their elections. And
was that because they were finding problems?
Yes, and it was because they were convinced. It wasn't so much that there was evidence of problems, it was looking at it and saying, well, an observable vote counting system cannot demonstrate or prove that it is not rigged, that it's counting accurately. So that was making them very, very queasy. They have an easier ballot to count. I mean, in California, you're looking at, you know, a lot of
17 ballot measures.
Plus
our last program was on.
Yeah. So, you know, it's easier when you're counting one a parliamentary system. So there are different challenges here, but it would not be insuperable, and certainly not to just count the federal races and the statewide races. You're looking at 1, 2, or 3 races at a time. It's not very much. And I personally feel we owe that to our democracy. If we really want a democracy, we have to support it, and this is not asking too much. However, we live in the age of convenience. We live in the age of entertainment. Everybody wants to go home, watch it all on TV, see the red and blue blinking
that's
states.
what I was going to say. The biggest complainers about this would be the networks,
the media,
because they don't get to call the election.
Right, and these voting computers in many ways can be seen as props for the media extravaganza that is Decision 2016, just like the Super Bowl. It is a media event, and we've allowed that to happen, and it's a larger question. You could have a whole program, obviously, on that. Back to the audits, if it were possible to have a kind of audit that was effective, that was timely, that was on election night, that had standards, that was truly random and not telegraphed in advance, and that was public, and it was particularly if it was a risk limiting audit where close races received more of an audit.
Yeah.
And that's a difficult rationale to describe. It's in the book. But there's a lot of reason why a risk limiting audit would be more effective. If it were all those things, I'd support that in a heartbeat. And as a matter of fact, if you were to propose, if you came from the other side of the political divide, and you were to say, okay, I'll give you universal, across the board, risk limiting audits in all the elections in this country, if you consent to voter ID, that voters will need a photo ID, that is not made impossible to get. The devil's in the details, the administrative
Yeah.
details. But if it were a trade-off, basic trade-off, risk-limiting audit, voter ID, I'd take that in a heartbeat.
Okay, I do want to get to the audience soon, but we still have one big piece hanging out there, and that would be the question. You've described pretty much how these machines are vulnerable because the results have to be transmitted or something. Give us some ideas how people could change how these machines are counting the ballots and reporting incorrect totals. That's part one. And part two is one of the, probably the major defense that you hear about electronic voting and trusting this unobserved vote count is that because of the decentralized nature of U.S. voting, it's state by state and then county by county, and as you pointed out, city by city, it would take, the argument is it would take a massive conspiracy that probably couldn't be pulled off to really change the votes. So I know you've written a whole book on this, but see if you can take a few minutes to get that across to the audience, how this happens. So first of all, what's it take to change a vote total that's being reported by a given machine? Okay,
well, that you're getting into eye-glazing territory if you want to get technical about it, but I'll give the simplest.
That's what we want.
Very simplest. And that is, you could just, all these machines on their memory cards, and a memory card has about 500 to 700,000 lines of code on it. It's a lot of code, way larger than the book, you know, if you just put it out on paper. And if you just alter the zero counters, so let's say I want Hillary to win and I want Donald to lose, so I go in and I alter the zero counters. I give Hillary a +100 zero counter, and I give Donald a -100 zero
So
counter.
instead of starting at 0 when they
First ballot that's counted for Hillary is 101. First
Yeah.
ballot counted for Donald is -99.
Yeah, okay.
At the end of the day, that machine records the correct number of votes in terms of the number of voters who came in, signed the poll book. The election administrator says, okay, I had 1,000 voters, 1,000 people came in inside the poll book. The machine records 1,000 votes. If those voters came in and voted 500, right, for Hillary and Donald, you'd have Hillary with 600 and Donald with 400. That takes 3 lines of code interpolated into those 500,000 lines of code. That is, you know, really literally middle school level programmer stuff. It's that simple. And you can replicate that on memory card after memory card after memory card. Only the corporation knows where those memory cards are earmarked to go. They know which precincts those memory cards are going to. And that, and then I'll just throw in that they've also now discovered through the work of Bev Harris and her assistant that virtually all these machines in their fundamental programming are programmed to divide votes into fractions, into hundredths. And this appears so many times in the coding that it's clearly not a mistake. It's deliberate, it's redundant. And what that'll, what that allows you to do is basically preset the results. And you don't actually have to shift vote by vote or reset the zero counters or do anything. You can basically just set the results on the machine and make the votes in a very simple algorithm fit those outcomes that you're dialing in. So, I mean, that's incredibly dangerous. They first thought that it was only on the gems. Now they, certain operating system, now they see that it's pretty much widespread through all the equipment from Dominion, ES&S, Hard Intercivic, Sequoia, et cetera, basically all the voting machines in the country. So, you know, the gate is wide open, the means are there. The second question, this idea that it's decentralized and it would take a vast conspiracy. I mean, our forensics say it's happened, just to put in that little asterisk.
Right.
And it didn't take a vast conspiracy.
And I'm sure that's going to come up in the audience Q&A.
Yeah, we'll get to that. And, you know, and I don't even like to go there. I don't like to talk forensics because that's always looking to the past. And we're not looking to overturn the Bush presidency or the 2016 primaries even. I mean, what we're looking at is prospectively having a system that actually can earn the trust of the public and
Right.
of the, So the decentralization of the system, it's actually not true. There are very few types of machines and types of operating systems operating out there. You could sit down in a war room, Karl Rove, and put a map on the wall with a bunch of push pins and say, okay, these are the Dominion machines. These are where there are, ES and S, 100s.
manufacturers,
Yeah,
yeah.
and these are the subcontractors that do the programming. These are the people we have to talk to. It's not. I'm not saying that's necessarily happening in every election, but it certainly is it's more than a possibility. It's an open invitation, the system we have now. This is the highest stakes game there is. When you look at baseball, you look at A-Rod, you look at Barry Bonds, you look at Lance Armstrong, you look at Volkswagen, you look at Sony hack, you look at, these Madoff and his Wall Street scheme. Where the stakes are high and nobody is looking, or they're not believed, or they're not looking hard enough, you see the will to win in the current climate especially, is basically irrepressible. The stakes couldn't be higher. And so if you don't have barriers that create a significant risk of detection, exposure, the incentive to go ahead and do it is very, very high. The means are there, the opportunity is there. And unfortunately, it does not take a vast conspiracy. It really just takes a couple of operatives. And that's, for this type of rigging, there's also we didn't talk about the real-time rigging that we saw in 2004 and we saw again in 2012, although it was, again, this is based on our forensics and on inside tips and whatnot. We can't prove it, but it's pretty probative. It was thwarted in 2012, but it was not thwarted in 2004 when the votes of Ohio, the server went down under Ken Blackwell. The votes got shunted over to Chattanooga, Tennessee under Mike Connell, Karl Rove's late and lamented IT guru. Basically, he had them on his servers to do whatever he wanted in real time. They were then sent back into the counties, and all of a sudden Bush went from 3% behind to 3% ahead, just like that. This is real-time rigging. This is also, it takes a bit more of an operation, but again, nothing that is reliant upon the kind of, big cast of characters where you're likely to have somebody come out and spill the beans. And anybody who looked like they were about to spill the beans was taking literally their life in their hands.
Basically, the voting may be decentralized, but the machines, the computer code are not, because they're coming from a very few sources.
And also, the presidential election comes down to very few states, and control of the House comes down to very few districts. Control of the Senate comes down to very few states. So again, you don't have to go countrywide. You just target, just the way we do when we're doing forensics. We on election night make a list of the elections that are going to be suspect.
Or when the campaigns
and where we're going to look.
do for voter turnout. They work a lot harder in certain districts than they do in others.
And there's plenty of money to fund all this.
We are eating into the audience's time here, and I want to always make sure this is a conversation with everyone. It's other voices. So if you have a question or comment, raise your hand and wait for Crystal to arrive with the microphone. And when she does, if you'll stand up and hold that mic right in front of your mouth. Stand up, please.
Hello, I'm Brent Turner with the National Association of Voting Officials. I wanted to thank you for showing up tonight in California and giving such eloquent information. My question to you was, you mentioned the rift between the audit folks and the folks talking about hand counting. My question is, did you put any information in your book, or what's your position regarding the movement toward removing the corporations from controlling the software? In other words, the open source software movement that is pushing for publicly owned voting systems with hand countable paper ballots.
Yeah, Brent, it wasn't a major point of emphasis in the book, although I support the concept. I did talk quite a bit about audits and how they can be made stronger. I think open source is a part of the picture where it's not as strongly under corporate proprietary control. there is still a lot, even with open source, as we know, in the pipeline where you get from the source code to the actual tabulation on election day. There's still some dark passages to go through, and I like to. If you look at a pipe and you're trying to decide whether it's transparent or not, and 99% of it is transparent, and then you have a piece of duct tape around it here, that's where the manipulation is going to take place, if it's going to take place. So the people who are trumpeting the transparency of the other 99% of the pipe, in many ways that's a false assurance. So I think that in looking at open source that way, it is almost certainly necessary and almost certainly not sufficient to have an election that we can really trust. You need to have that and either scrupulous audits or that and other protections along the way. But it is something that we should adopt, and of course the corporations will probably fight it tooth and nail.
That sounded a little bit like inside the movement finesse or debating there, but I take this, and we didn't really talk about this, but one of the problems in this whole big picture is that the large corporations that manufacture the machines and write the code that do the counting hold that code pretty close so that the public really can't even examine the code. Is that correct?
Oh, that's certainly true. I mean, the courts have backed them up in that. It's corporate property, and
trade secrets.
Trade secrets, corporate property. That trumps the public interest in
He's ruined the use of a perfectly
I know,
good word.
Terrible. Rigged. He's ruined rigged for us, and he's ruined trumps. A lot of where I wind up sort of heading to in this in Code Red is that this is really a battle over information. It's a battle over whether information is public or it's corporate. And in fact, we're seeing a lot of retrograde motion in that area. We're seeing a lot of states taking ballots and taking them out, exempting them from public records laws, from FOIA requests and stuff, making them more difficult to access. They were already pretty difficult. Where candidates have the right to do so, most of the time it's made prohibitively expensive at precisely the point in their campaign where they've run out of money. It's post-election. They've already spent all their money. They're in debt. So it's basically for a whole bunch of reasons. I mean, these ballots do not see the light of day, even in very, very suspect elections. In cases where it actually has gone beyond that and it's gone to a recount, I like to say that, if the incentive to rig an election is X, the incentive to cover it up, if there's an investigation of that rig, is 1,000X. And we saw that in Wisconsin in the Kloppenberg, and the Kloppenberg isn't going to mean much, but the Supreme Court race there, where there was a recount, and we saw the recount, and the ballot bags were ripped open. So there were these supposedly sealed ballot bags from the very counties, Dane County, Milwaukee County, that were suspect. The bags came in all ripped open, and objections were filed and duly noted and then completely ignored. So you had a recount in which there was every opportunity to go in exactly where the manipulation had occurred and substitute in ballots that matched the machine count. The frustrations of election integrity advocacy are manifold. I'll go to one other frustration.
You've been doing this a long time yourself, right?
Yeah, 15 years. 2002 was basically the start. And I thought at the time, boy, we could set up a burglar alarm system, an exit poll-based burglar alarm system, and it would be no problem to raise $5 million or so to do that. People care about their country, care about their elections. I mean, I was just short about 5 zeros. I mean, it was shocking, and it remains. It's no longer shocking. Let's put it that way. The way the media and the political casts have closed ranks and united to say our elections are sound, let's not hear another word about it. I mean, you can understand that they don't want to be the laughingstock of the world. We don't want to have chaos. We don't want to have, uprisings and civil war. But that doesn't mean that our elections are sound. And saying that they are is not making them so. And that's all we're getting right now. And so here we are, we're in bed with Donald Trump. I mean, who, by the way, is no longer really on the rigging path because he thinks he's going to win. So his interest in election integrity has basically lapsed.
Yeah, because he's liking polls again.
He's liking polls, and he likes the vote counting process. This is our electoral integrity standard bearer of the month, Donald J. Trump. I mean, the frustration, getting this book out, getting this word out. I just, submitted an op-ed to the New York Times, a letter to the editor, absolutely knowing that there was 0.0 chance that they would be printed. And we're used to that. And, whether it's the Times or even Mother Jones, even the progressive populist, I mean, the supposedly, left-wing progressive media, Terry Gross, Charlie Rose, nobody wants to go there.
Thank heavens for other voices brought to you by Peninsula Peace and
Thank you very much. And thank you for coming here and being
but
here.
we're not done yet. Are there more questions or comments in the audience? Right down front here, and then there'll be one over on the other side, Crystal.
Yeah, my name is Shirley Ingalls. I'm a little bit confused because I think I heard you say that the Republicans were able to rig George W. Bush's election. And I'm wondering how Barack Obama, I remember after Barack Obama was voted in, Karl Rove simply could not believe it happened. So I'm assuming he tried to rig it. And the question is, why wasn't he able to do it?
Yes, that is in the book, by the way. And, to the best of our understanding, what happened on election night 2012 was sort of the equivalent to the cyber shootout at the OK Corral. You got the white hats and the black hats shooting it out in cyberspace to, protect the universe from whatever Men in Black says, from the scum of the cosmos or something. Anonymous came in, they infiltrated Karl Rove's Orca operation. They got somebody in there who got into the computers, basically locked out Rove's operatives. So when they went in, and then the machines went down in Ohio, just like they did in 2004, the votes were going to be shunted, and we suspect there were a few other states involved too, although that's speculation on my part. It would have taken 170,000 votes to turn the election for Romney, which is a very small proportion of the votes, concentrated basically in 4 states that were very close: Virginia, New Hampshire, Ohio, and I believe North Carolina, but I'm not sure. And basically, the operatives attempted to get in to this, what was ostensibly a get out the vote operation, but had actually been hooked into the servers where the votes were. And which, as we know, we can do anything in cyberspace. It's pretty open world. And they were locked out. They got the equivalent of Jurassic Park. Ha 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 ha. You're not getting in. The passwords weren't working. Karl Rove didn't know this, so he was waiting for these new numbers to come, which never came. That is the story as I know it. Can I prove it? No. Do I have documentary evidence? No. It was covered by Tom Hartman in a show. He gave about 20 minutes to it that I thought was fairly convincing, and I also have some undisclosed, unfortunately, people who are not willing to go on the record, but who have attested to this happening, and some people from Anonymous who were willing to go on the record, and that's what happened in 2012. 2008 was a little more complicated.
I would like to point out, we do have the video evidence of Karl Rove melting down on Fox TV when Ohio was called for Obama.
We do, and you got to look at that in context. I mean, Karl Rove was a very careful character. He was not given to public humiliations of any sorts, so it was extremely out of character, and it was based on, again, we believe the fact that he was anticipating information. He kept talking about server issues, which of course was a huge red flag, and then he kept talking about these narrowing of this. These vote counts that he had that nobody else had. And so, there's a lot of smoke around. There's so much smoke in the field of election integrity. I mean, that to imagine that there is no fire at all is kind of silly. On the other hand, I don't think we have to prove that elections have been rigged to make the case that the system as it's now constituted cannot demonstrate that it's not rigged. And that's where the burden of proof shifts, when the level of trust begins to sink whether it's because of Donald Trump and his forces or anybody else. It was bound to be somebody sooner or later who basically says, the emperor is naked. We can't trust this system. The system cannot answer that because it is unobservable and because it cannot prove that these counts that are happening in the darkness of cyberspace are legitimate. So it's getting, it's territory where legitimacy begins, apart from the effect on history and these results, and it always seems to be going in the right-wing direction, that it's sort of unidirectional. But apart from that, just the very legitimacy, whatever side you're on, is really being called into question. And I do think also that the political pickle that we're in, which we're not really here to address tonight, but it should be very obvious, is in many ways related to the breakdown in our vote counting and our electoral system, because the public will is being distorted. It's not being accurately translated. And on whatever side of the political spectrum you're on, the feeling you begin to get is that the political system is completely unresponsive. And that's true for the people on the Trump side as well as for the people on the progressive side. And it leads to this kind of really bad politics, really distorted politics. When you can win any election, no matter how radical you get, and that's partly what was established during this period from 2004 to 2014, it emboldens you to be more and more radical, get as much bang for the buck as you can. And that's what happened with the Republican Party. Of course, there are other factors. But we think this is a strong contributing factor, and it's distorted our entire politics and put us into a real mess right now.
So let's, we've got several hands. You are next. We have 5 minutes left for 4 questions, I see. So be terse.
And I will too.
My name is Nassim Nouri, and I wanted to ask you about the overwhelming amount of evidence that Bernie Sanders supporters were able to collect and share electronically for the primary election. And there was a very short documentary called Uncounted that reported the evidence of a lot of tampering and a lot of mishandling of ballots in San Diego. Out of that, and I believe other cases, there were many lawsuits that were filed. Would you just cover that real quick and to the state of where they're at? And do you believe that is a viable strategy for us as citizens to push forward, be poll observers and volunteer just so that we can keep an eye on the system? Does that work?
Short answer, no, but I wouldn't discourage it. We do need as many eyes as possible. Unfortunately, there are a lot of key places where the eyes just cannot see, and that's the problem. Lawsuits, there is no brief way of discussing lawsuits, but they have, for the most part, not worked very well. Some of the key ones to get access to information have been dismissed one way or another. And they tend to be very slow. And what happens with elections is there's a very brief period of public focus and media focus on any potential shenanigans. And by the time the lawsuit winds up going through the pipe, you've lost that wave. I've been advocating, something more radical, civil disobedience, op-scan parties. It's in the book, where people basically, assert the right and say, those are our ballots. When they disappear into the op scan, they don't become corporate property. We want that op scan to be opened, and we want to be able to initiate, at least symbolically, a public count. I believe that in many cases, especially places like California, that could take place with the cooperation of election officials. It doesn't necessarily have to be confrontational. It's a bit of a revolution, but it's a very nonviolent revolution in process that could begin to set a pattern and set a precedent for what would be happening elsewhere, and certainly draw attention to this issue. Being mere poll workers or forming going out to the square and marching around with signs or protesting, or even the online, social media stuff, it's worked to an extent, but it hasn't really changed the system.
Let me try to get one more in. Dorothy, right in the back row, was the next one in line there.
Just a few words about the history, what happened in this primary, and the potential future of exit polling.
Oof. Well, I mean, exit polling right now is again a hot topic for debate because there were huge disparities in the Democratic primaries against Sanders, basically, and virtually nothing in the Republican primaries. And these polls were conducted by the same firm on the same day by the same interviewers at the same precincts. They're all competent over here, and they're all way off in the same direction over here. The problem with exit poll, and then you could compare the caucuses with the primaries, completely different results in those for Sanders. The Sanders people had a very, very strong reason for being aggrieved and upset. The problem with exit polling evidence is that we're unlikely ever to prove anything by statistical inference. And that's why the system itself, there's one place where the truth comes out, and that's public observable counting of the actual ballots. And unless we're willing to have that as inconvenient as it may be, as a component of our democracy, my feeling is we don't necessarily deserve a democracy, we deserve what we get.
We're going to have to, I'm sorry folks, we're going to have to let the questions go there. What would you suggest the people here in this audience go home and do this evening to write to Congress, read your book?
Well, don't beat the dog. I don't think writing to Congress has much in it, especially from a small group, but communication is very important. Social media is the modern means of communication, getting out there where there is information, such as my book, or such as Wasserman and Fitrakis' book, or such as Dorothy Fadiman's films, you know, to spread the word about them, see if you can ruin some people's days and get them to, you know, start paying attention to this and feeling responsible as citizens.
In other words, educate yourself and then educate others.
And educate others and really be tenacious and don't give it up.
And I've got to let it go there. We've been talking with Jonathan Simon, author of the newly updated Code Red, Computerized Election Theft, and the New American Century. Jonathan, thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much, Paul.
Thank you all for coming tonight.
Thank you.
Learn.
Thank you.